Let's chat just a bit about fighting in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, first version published these many years ago. And I have my little sheet with me, which I made for uh, the players in the current game. And it is very much a first contact sheet and doesn't have a bunch of things in it. And I hope I can show you why. We will begin with a combat circumstance without surprise. And I know that sounds counterintuitive because you should start with surprise in most cases, but you won't understand surprise unless you understand what one might be surprised about. So let's just concern ourselves with what's called a combat round, which is a minute of diegetic time. All right, we are going to play this minute. And the one thing you do at the beginning of every round is to roll initiative, which is rolled with one die per side. So you have a side of characters and a side of opponents in the most simple circumstances. So you roll one die for each. These are not generally modified. These are not compared to each other in terms of values. It's either one side is higher or they're tied. In which case, just keep in mind one side has, for this minute, the circumstances of the fight, however they need to be justified or discussed or conceived as we go along, favor that side, the members of that side. Just taking that as a given. Now, how is this handled? First, we're going to resolve the things that involve no running about. The things that can be performed very quickly. Those include, dragon breath. They include prepared missiles. Somebody, given the circumstances of last time, is in place with, another missile ready to go. And also, or near enough, and also, say, a spell that, again, we know has had reason to be ready to pop at that point. There are a number of other things, but these are the things that we're going to take care of right away. And they are handled by the side with initiative, letting them off, and then the side without initiative, if anybody is doing any such thing, letting theirs off. So we just handle that right out of the gate. Then we're going to look at everybody who is involved in, for lack of a better word, minimal movement and reasonably involved activity. So this would include fighting somebody. You're already in place. You're already fighting a dude or very close to it. That's the primary example. So at that point, all the people on the side with the initiative will conduct their attacks. And all the people then who survive will conduct theirs. So then finally, we look at all those things which would have taken more time, bearing in mind that all of these are considered to be somewhat more of an assembly of a minute than they are a strict, okay, then this happens, then this happens, then this happens. It's kind of the result of them happens in that order. So the dudes who were fighting while the guy was taking his arrow shot. It's just that the arrow shot is going to conclude before the fighting concludes. So we can keep in mind that any number of statements may alter a few things. For example, where a couple of fighting combatants may go and stuff like that. They have a whole minute after all. So they're all at each other, fighting away. But as I say, certain things are going to land later. Somebody who is busy, hoping that they don't catch an arrow between the shoulder blades, picking a lock, or somebody who had a spell that was not ready to go. Now, spells are listed with a number of segments, 6-second units, that they will take to go off, but at this point, we do not consider ourselves with segments. All we needed to know was they were going to be busy for a while. Everybody with anything that's busy for a while, in the most general sense, now it all takes place after we've resolved all that melee, and the order then is similar to the beginning, missile shots and then spells. Any number of other actions can be sort of categorized into these, and managed that way. So that's really it. We don't have to look at segments at all at this point. Now for the things that modify it. Modification number one, in fact, the biggie, the huge one, is movement. If you're an archer and you want to go and jump up on that pillar to get a shot at a bunch of, at targets that you couldn't otherwise get a good shot at, we will pop you into the end. That's why I mentioned missile stuff at the end instead of at the beginning. Your movement, kept you busy for a while. So automatically you're in the for a while category and you're not in melee. So over you go to that sort of ending cleanup aspect of the minute. And the same thing goes for any number of other things that involve movement. If you want to go trotting over somewhere and do a thing, well, then we're just going to put you over at the end of it all. There are many, many ways in which this matters. It is tremendously consequential because a lot of people are going to want to do things that involve going somewhere first. You may even end up with a bit of a repeat of the round procedure just because everybody involved in that group of people had to go running around doing things. So that ends up with our basic round. Now we will concern ourselves with those things that require a zoom in. And you really should think of it as zooming in. There are certain circumstances where zooming in becomes very important. One of them would concern, the magic scary guy has his magical fingers pointed at me and I have hefted my broad axe and I'm doing my level best to reach him before the lightning bolt incinerates me. And I now would look at my movement, right? And I can divide, so that's for a round. And we can talk about whether, the running part of it, but whatever it is, we're saying I'm running and we figure out that movement rate. And then we say, so how many segments is it going to take for me to get there? And we can also concern ourselves with the segments that it would take for this spell to go off. So we can compare those. Now we know whether I can get there in time before the lightning bolt fritzes me, or vice versa. And so that's what the segments are for. Segments are also utilized for any other dicey little comparison of moving at each other. Movement is usually what invokes it. But there are other times too when, for example, two spellcasters, zapping at each other, and one might say, well, wait, doesn't one side have initiative? Bear in mind, there can be simultaneous initiative. Say we've got simultaneous initiative and we've got spellcasters zapping each other. Well, compare the segments of the spells. So that's what the segments are for these moments when we would like to have a little bit more fine-grained logic about whether this gets there before that gets there. So segments then become a focus on just those two characters. It's still in the context of initiative, as I just implied, and it is very, very useful for those immediate moments. This can be a big deal, for example, when a thief is attempting to do the hide in shadows during melee, which can sometimes be a little bit of a logic problem, and other times, given the number of segments that one would identify with what the opponents are doing, actually isn't that bad an idea and makes a lot of sense. So just quickly looking at these specific opposed actions in terms of segments allows us to zoom in on that, and where that falls in the context of the overall minute can be approximately placed by the maximum number of segments, but we really don't have to place it in terms of the precise number of segments that it finishes at relative to everything else. We just have to know whether we think it happens in, that flash point in the front, which typically it doesn't if it requires this segment check, or somewhere in the middle with all the melee going on, or sort of in the close-up, clean out, everybody doing everything that lands later, whether it lands at the end, somewhere in there. Exactly where things land relative to one another is generally not important. And when it is, then we can go and say, well, wait a minute, how many segments did that take? How many segments did that take? Since we have to now, because we want to know which one lands first, that can tell us. Surprise is another good example of when we will need the segments. And surprise is conducted only once when potential combatants come into one another's sphere of activities with the chance or the understanding that surprise is possible. If we are in circumstances in which surprise makes no sense whatsoever, then we don't use it. But when we do, then, and don't confuse this with initiative at all, then similarly, a single die is rolled for each side. And this has slightly different rules because it actually does have numerical meaning. You roll for your side to see if you're surprised, and there is a particular range, usually 1 to 2, but certain characters are surprised less often, and if they're surprised less often, then your whole side benefits from that. Then there are foes that screw up your chances so that you may be surprised on a wider range. And so in that case, you roll theirs, or then it's adjusted by the people who have better, whatever it is. The point is you end up with some set of values on the D6 for your whole side. That means your side is surprised. So both sides might be surprised, neither side might be surprised, or one is surprised. Here things get a little interesting. You take, if one side is surprised and the other is not, that's easy. Take the difference between the two rolls. And the difference is the number of free segments that the unsurprised side gets to act. This might be important because you might have a spell that is very few segments, and you might get enough of a difference that you could even get that spell off, or at least get a certain amount of its preparation going. So that you would say, actually, I'm coming in pretty hot on the beginning of the next formal round. So you could do that. Another thing, which is very common, is to close. So therefore, you could set up where you go relative to where everyone else goes, or where the people on the other side go, without them being able to do much about it. This may or may not allow time for an attack. Typically, it doesn't. Surprise, being able to attack on surprise, occurs if you're already nose to nose. And if there's a question about that, well, then take a look at things like the distance that you moved or anything like that to figure out whether you've got the segments for an attack. Typically, you won't unless the difference is huge. So anyway, surprise permits this, to occur. What about the other interesting details of surprise? One of them is that certain individuals have reaction adjustments. High dexterity gives you a reaction adjustment so that your surprise result is, say, 1 or 2 segments less. If your side is surprised, you are surprised for less segments than the other people in your group. Now, this didn't change the actual comparison of surprise. You've still established, for example, that your side is surprised and the other side is not. But regarding the segments of activity of the other side coming in against you, for example, may be able to have your shield up or anything of that nature, or to maybe even do a little moving yourself, perhaps before they can get to you, because you've got just a little bit more activity during their incoming assault than your friends do. So this is one thing to take into account. Also very segmented, to coin a phrase. The other thing that matters a lot for this is when both sides are surprised or neither side is surprised. If both or neither are surprised, well, if neither is surprised, that's one thing. We just go into a combat round. If both are surprised, then we treat it as one side being surprised by looking at the values, so that you might have, I'm surprised, but we get surprised on a 1 to 3, and We rolled a 3, and you get surprised, and you are surprised on some range, and you got surprised on a 1 by rolling a 1. So we look at the difference, and then we treat it as one side surprised, with that difference in favor of the side that rolled better, which in this case is actually rolling lower. So it is a fairly understandable system, but that's one thing that pulls in thinking about segments really fast, because you often do this first, and therefore everybody's kind of thinking in a segmented way that they have to kind of clean out of their heads when we move into the formal combat. So segments are something that you invoke when you need them and apply to the larger round as we understand it based on everything else. So that's where segments come in. You do not, in this game, and there is no example in which this is the case, play through the segments sequentially until you've reached the 10th segment, and the round is done. The round is the minute. That's what we're resolving. Segments are a way to refine certain actions landing in certain orders, and that's it. Final point. When initiative is overridden completely for some particular character or group of characters in the midst of all of this, for some of them, that initiative roll turns out to be completely irrelevant and is junked. Case 1, charging a prepared group of people with weapons designed to repel charges. Forget it. They hit you first. We're done. I don't care if you got, the high initiative roll or not. They're there with the phalanx of spear dudes is waiting for you, and no, you cannot say, I have high initiative, I shall go and attack one of them first. No, you won't. You get spitted. Okay, so there's a bunch of things like that, of which that is the most prominent, no pun intended, the most prominent case, and they're easy to understand. Oh, look at that. No, dude, you're host. They will get the first strike on you if you do that. So that's settled. The other one is very interesting, and it is reserved for, as it is said, important one-on-one duels. In the context of this larger round, we may have someone who hates someone, and there is going to be a personal fight involved. Personally, I would relax the one-on-one part. I could imagine this easily being a matter for, 2-on-1 or something like that. But whatever it is, it's a very limited number of combats. And as I say, these are named characters, I would think, or as good as named. The rest of the round becomes sort of background chatter, while we, to some extent, even freeze time. To some extent, sort of bubble our attention is a better way to put it. And we're going to look at this fight. Initiative is junked. We look at weapon speed factor. We look at a few other details of the situation that may matter. I should point out that the text is clear that we do not consider this in circumstances of charging. Charging is one of those things that has been accounted for already in terms of who strikes first. So whether it's by the movement and segments, or whether it's based on the weapon types, as I mentioned before, that overrode initiative. No, we are dealing with a situation in which the opponents in question are squared off, and both are capable of hitting one another, and it is a matter of who they are, what weapons they are using, and that's where speed factor comes in, and that's where a number of other matters get invoked that do not show up at any other point in the application of the system. So keep in mind, there is kind of a little sort of dueling subset and other things that we ordinarily pay a great deal of attention to, like initiative, step out of the system. There's a lot of footnotes or footnote-y paragraphs in the text, all sorts of things about weapon effectiveness against particular kinds of armor, or aspects of cover how, what happens to the chances to hit based on what sort of cover the target is hiding behind, and lots of other things. But every single one of those is very easily referenced and very easily applied once you understand that bigger picture and recognize that, as I say, we are not proceeding through a sort of arbitrary 10 block units of 6 seconds played in sequence combat rounds. We're not doing that, nor are we enslaved to a missile phase, magic phase, melee phase, such that if you're shooting a bow, it doesn't matter if you jump up on the pillar, you still get to go first because, you're shooting a bow and it's in missile phase. No such thing is invoked here. So what we typically see is that everybody has to say what they're doing to start. And since a certain flexibility during the minute is understood, certainly one could say in the middle, I said I was going to go and engage with these orc guys, but you know what? I mean, the missile shots have gone off and the magic has gone off and everything else has just gone bonkers. I'm calling it. I didn't get to my attack. I'm running over there. I'm jumping behind the rock. That's just all I'm doing. Okay, no problem. You didn't get into the melee. You stated that you changed your mind. You said it a couple minutes ago, but you changed your mind, and now you're jumping behind the rock. No problem. Keeping in mind, too, that attacks are not single actions. It's super clear that is the damage that got done. If you did damage, that's the damage that you got done during the course of a minute. And so whether we can just abstract that and say things like hit and miss and move on and kind of let everybody's individual imaginations take care of the minute, or we can think about that and say, well, geez, you guys were fighting over the rubble. You were both trying to get to the bridge first while you fought, and this ended up, you took that damage and the dude, didn't take any. I think he's making it to the bridge first. That sort of thing. That can all be managed very, very easily, and I have never seen a single dispute about that logic in action by anybody. Somebody says, well, it should go like this, and it works. So typically, managing the nuances within the course of that minute, if you know what you need to know systemically, then coming up with the nuances of exactly what occurs about, the little things is quite simple. I find it very functional. I'm pleased to discover that this time, very carefully reading through the Player's Handbook version and then through the DM Guide version, there is no contradiction whatsoever. The Player's Handbook version is a very nice basic abstraction of it, and then the DM Guide provides a lot of the little pieces here and there, and when certain things are used and when they're not. So I don't think it's more than 5 pages of reading, and albeit tiny text, but it's not particularly difficult, and it's just neither the super round, the 3 minutes of Tunnels and Trolls, with very big blocks of beginning, middle, and end, if necessary. It's not that, like with collective rolls, right? Just 2 massive rolls opposed to one another, and then a couple of little spot checks here and there. It's not that, nor is it either the Fantasy Trip or the RuneQuest versions, which, although different, typically play out as shooter's eye view. This next, then this next, then this next, bam, 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 in very small time units. So it's neither one of those. It has aspects mainly of the first. And then it has that zoom in, telescoping, moment-to-moment thing, which is a little bit more like the second. And again, you only invoke that either in the form of segments or in the form of the nuanced speed factor, eyeball-to-eyeball fight thing when they're needed.